Welcome, new academic scholars, to this explainer. Okay, so if you're just stepping into the world of higher education or maybe embarking on your very first major academic project, the word research can honestly feel incredibly intimidating. It sounds heavy, complex, and maybe even a little isolating. But today, we're going to change that perspective. We're transforming this seemingly daunting process into an exciting, highly systematic journey of discovery. By the end of our time together, you'll see exactly how to navigate your way from a simple idea to a really meaningful academic contribution.
All right, let's dive right into our blueprint for the day. We'll be looking at defining English language research, language versus literary studies, the systematic research process, defining variables and hypotheses, and finally, wrapping up with ethics and academic integrity. So, starting things off with Section 1, defining English language research. For a lot of us coming from an English background, we might assume research just means, well, reading a ton of books and writing a huge essay about them. But in the academic field of linguistics and language learning, it's actually a rigorous scientific investigation. And I really want to anchor our whole discussion right here with this fantastic definition from John W. Creswell. He says, research is a process of steps used to collect and analyze information to increase our understanding of a topic. And actually, if you look closer at the word itself, the French root of research is rechercher, which literally means to search again or investigate carefully. So you're not just searching once, you're engaging in this highly systematic, objective, and scientific quest to verify existing knowledge, solve real-world communication problems, or discover entirely new facts about how humans acquire and use language. Moving right along to Section 2, language versus literary studies. Now, what's really interesting here is that if you're coming from a traditional English background, you absolutely need to understand the fundamental shift we're making. The difference between analyzing literature and analyzing language itself is huge. Literary research, which you might be super familiar with, is highly interpretive and subjective. It's all about themes, characters, literary criticism, that sort of thing. Language research, on the flip side, it is entirely scientific and objective. Instead of just interpreting texts, you're gathering hard, quantifiable data. You're using statistical analysis to study things like communication, grammar, vocabulary, or pronunciation. It's literally a shift from subjective interpretation to objective, data-driven science. Which brings us to Section 3, the systematic research process. Because language research is a science, right? It requires a super clear, replicable method. You can't just wander aimlessly into an investigation. There's actually a core 10-stage blueprint to conducting research, and we're going to break this down into two manageable phases. Let's look at Phase 1, planning. This is where your study is basically born. First, you identify the problem. Then you review the existing literature, to see what's already out there. From there, you define your specific objectives, formulate hypotheses, and select your research design. To make this a bit more concrete, let's use a running example. Let's say you want to study how technology affects vocabulary learning. Identifying the problem might literally be noticing your students are struggling to retain new words. Reviewing the literature, that means reading past studies on mobile-assisted language learning. And defining your objective is deciding to test a specific mobile app right there in your classroom. Okay, let's move to Phase 2 and see how this builds. Once your plan is totally locked in, you jump into execution. This is where you actually roll up your sleeves and do the work. First, you collect your data, maybe by giving those students vocabulary tests after they use the app. Then you analyze that data, usually crunching some statistics, to interpret your findings. Finally, you draw your conclusions and write up the final report. This whole 10-step process ensures that literally anyone else in the world could replicate your exact study and see if they get the exact same results. All right, on to Section 4, defining variables and hypotheses. Now, I'll be honest, this is often the trickiest part of the planning phase for new scholars. But we're going to map these abstract terms directly onto our technology example so you can see exactly how they work in the real world. First up, we have the independent variable. By definition, this is the factor manipulated by the researcher. Basically, it's the cause. In our running example, the independent variable is the use of online learning or technology. You, as the researcher, are in total control of this. You decide whether a student uses the cool new vocabulary app or reads a traditional textbook. You are actively manipulating this variable to see what happens. And that immediately connects us to the dependent variable, which is the outcome that gets measured. It's the effect. In our vocabulary app example, the dependent variable is the student's actual vocabulary learning, like their final test scores. It literally depends on the independent variable. You manipulate the technology, and then you measure the resulting vocabulary learning.
And this brilliantly illustrates how we actually make predictions. Based on those variables, researchers formulate a hypothesis, which is just a tentative prediction. But in the scientific world, you usually set up two competing predictions. The null hypothesis, or H0, takes the skeptic's view. It states that the independent variable will have no significant effect on the dependent variable. So for us, that's technology has no significant effect on vocabulary learning. Pitted right against this is your alternative hypothesis, H1, which is usually the awesome thing you're actually hoping to prove, like technology significantly improves vocabulary learning. Ultimately, your hard data will decide which of these statements survives.
Finally, we arrive at Section 5, Ethics and Academic Integrity. Here's the thing. The entire scientific process we just geeked out over, the variables, the data collection, the hypotheses, it is completely useless if it isn't built on a rock-solid foundation of honesty. The scientific community relies on strict ethical guardrails, and one of the biggest ethical pitfalls for you as a new scholar is plagiarism. Presenting another person's work or ideas as your own. And it's not always just maliciously copying and pasting an entire essay. There's direct plagiarism, which is word-for-word copying without attribution. There's self-plagiarism, where you actually reuse your own past submitted work as if it were brand new. There's mosaic plagiarism, where you kind of weave phrases from a source into your own writing without quotes. And honestly, most dangerously for beginners, there's accidental plagiarism. This happens when you simply forget to cite a source, or maybe you paraphrase just a little too closely. But here's the catch. Even if it's a total accident, it severely compromises your academic integrity.
Which leaves us with a really crucial question. How do we actually prevent this? How do we make sure our systematic investigation stays purely ethical?
Well, the crucial point here is that preventing plagiarism is entirely about taking simple, structured steps to attribute ideas. It's really that simple. You absolutely must use proper citation styles like APA or MLA, depending on your institution's rules. You need to paraphrase appropriately, which means truly, genuinely putting ideas into your own words, and always use quotation marks for direct wording. Finally, running your work through plagiarism detection software before submitting is just a fantastic safety net. These practices don't just, follow the rules, they literally protect you as a scholar and maintain the trust of the entire scientific community.
So we've covered a ton of ground today in this explainer. From redefining research as a rigorous objective science to walking through the 10 core steps, nailing down our variables, and locking in our ethics, you now have the foundational blueprint to confidently navigate the academic world. So my final question to you is this. Now that you have the blueprint, what gap in our language knowledge are you going to investigate next? The field is wide open, and your systematic journey of discovery starts right now. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.